Hello and welcome to Grade 12 Find the Equations for the following sinusoidal graph. Here we have our sinusoidal graph and our two forms that the equation can take. First with the sine equation and secondly with the cosine equation. And you'll remember from your study of y equals sine x and y equals cos x that one was simply a slight translation of the other. So it's easy enough to find two equations or more for the same graph. When looking at the sinusoidal, then A, B, and D will all be the same for the two forms of the equation. The amplitude is still the amplitude, the period doesn't change, nor does the sinusoidal axis, or midline, as our textbook calls it. The only difference then will be the C, the horizontal translation or phase shift. Now the first thing that you would like to find in order is A, but the easiest thing to find first is actually D. So I'm going to put in a line where the sinusoidal axis would be. And first to find that, then look for your maximum, which is at 3, and your minimum for this one is at -1, and halfway between those two values, we will be at +1. So the sinusoidal axis then would be y equals 1, which will then give us a d value of 1. Our amplitude, then remember, is the distance between the maximum and the sinusoidal axis, or the minimum and the sinusoidal axis. And this is a good place to check to make sure that we have our sinusoidal axis in the right place. Do these two arrows that I've just drawn match? And the maximum to sinusoidal is 2 points. Sinusoidal to minimum, again 2 points. So yes, we have drawn this in the correct location. So now we've got our A, which equals 2, an amplitude of 2, and our D at 1, because our sinusoidal axis is at y equals 1. Now to look for our period. I'm going to look at it from the sinusoidal point of view, from the sine curve point of view. And here we are at -pi/3, ending at +pi/3. So that means then that our period, -pi/3 absolute value, plus absolute value of pi/3, gives us a period of 2pi/3, or 2/3 pi. If that's the period, then our B is equal to 2 pi divided by our period, 2pi/3. B then is equal to 2 pi times 3/2 pi, because remember you invert and multiply to divide fractions. So that means that our 2 pi's will cancel, and we are left then with a B value equal to 3. So those are the pieces that are consistent between our two equations. So we can start by writing out y equals 2 for amplitude, sine B of 3, bracket, x, and now we have to have a look for our phase shift or our horizontal translation. So I'm going to go back to the graph where I had worked on to find my period, and I recognize that here I am at the sinusoidal axis going up to the right, so I have a horizontal translation of -pi/3. That means in my equation then that I have +pi/3 goes into my equation, and then picking up on my sinusoidal axis, +1. There we are. We have our sine equation. But looking at this, where I ended I could have just as easily used that as my starting point for the next sine curve. And that meant then that I could have considered this from the perspective of a horizontal translation of plus pi over 3. So I'll write that equation as well. Y equals 2 sine 3x minus pi over 3 plus 1. These are both equations for the same graph and both equally correct. When it comes time to a test or an assignment, I'm only going to ask you for one, but my answer key will have these two, plus I will have 2 for the cosine, which we'll do in a minute, so that because all of them will be correct. All right, so now looking at it from the perspective of the cosine wave. Now remember, cosine starts at the maximum. So here we are, halfway between negative pi over 3 and 0. So trying to find our maximum value halfway between negative pi over 3 and 0, and that's going to be a negative pi over 6. So that would be our horizontal translation for the cosine wave. So now we can write y equals 2, amplitude has not changed, cos 3, because the period has not changed, x plus pi over 6 plus 1. So that's the first of my cosine equations that I could consider. But you might have looked to the right of the xy axis and went, but I saw the translation as starting over here. And that too would be just as accurate. Now, you're halfway between pi over 3 and 2 pi over 3. So the maximum here is at pi over 2. And so our equation then would look like y equals 2 cos 3 x minus pi over 2 plus 1. 4 equations, 2 different ways of looking at it, whether you're looking from a sine or for a cosine, all of which are correct. Good luck finding the equations for the graphs.